everybody, this is Brian Aiello, and this is Mirage number 8, Speculating on Spec Fiction. Today, Varla Ventura is joining me again, and we're going to be speaking about Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. I, again, am speaking from a place of complete ignorance. I am obviously familiar with the subject, right? I mean, you cannot get away from Mary Shelley and Frankenstein in this culture. He's all over the place, the monster. But Frankenstein himself, the doctor, and Mary Shelley remain kind of masked in obscurity. But you yourself are a complete fangirl. You love the subject of Mary Shelley. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite novels, and I've read it on multiple occasions. Just sort of at different stages in my life, it's meant very different things to me. So I can guarantee you that there are people out there who know more about her, who have more insight into history and what was happening with her in her life. And there are people who have written her autobiographies. But I come to you as a fangirl, as someone who is also a writer and who has gotten something creative out of the book and out of her work, and I feel a strong connection to her as an artist.
When was the first time you broke the spine on a Mary Shelley book? As a person, as a woman, as a person.
Well, I wasn't a woman yet, I'll tell you that. I read things at an inappropriately young age. That's a true confession. I mean, I was watching and reading things that were not, and I'm not saying this like, oh, I was reading so high above my grade level.
Well, if I remember correctly, your mom was that type of cool. Like, she would hook you up.
I had access to things that, probably a lot of other kids my age didn't have. And I don't say that as, it was the 70s. It was a different time. There was more kind of freewheeling nudity and things like that in those days. And I'm not in any way implying that my parents were, neglectful or bad parents or anything like that. But I did have access to things that, a lot of people would probably deem inappropriate. And that includes, major occult texts, tarot decks, stories about the psychic arts, and then a lot of horror movies, horror fiction, horror comics. And it was, keep in mind also, I have many older siblings and older cousins. So I would go to my grandmother's to stay in the summertime, and, one sister left behind, Pet Cemetery, and another sister had on her shelf, a collection of Alfred Hitchcock short stories. And so that's kind of, and we're talking like 7, 8, 9 years old. I'm reading these things. I can read the words. Mm-hmm. I am not necessarily completely understanding the concepts by any means. So I would say, I feel like the first time I read Frankenstein, I was probably like 9, 10. And then I saw the Boris Karloff movie as a 11, 12-year-old, because, my mom saw me reading it and she said, well, you should really watch this movie. And then, we watched all of the spin-offs. And then, of course, in the early 80s, there was the more sort of romantic movie version that came out. And so I periodically would just, pick it up and read it. And I actually have, I don't have a collector's edition. I have a super cheap paperback with a, crumbling spine, but it's the one that I had that I've had since I was a kid. I probably stole it off my mom's shelf. It was probably published in the late 60s or so. There's no great deep insight in the intro or anything like that. It's just, here it is. Yeah. And I love it. It's got terrible art on the cover.
The way you talk about the book, though, it steals from it a little bit of the classic, doesn't it? I mean, what Mary Shelley wrote and what I was attempting to read, because I really did try. And I have 2 children. I have two 2.5-year-olds, and I broke it out. I downloaded it onto my phone, And,
You don't
I
have time to
write,
read anything
oh
if
my
you've
God, I don't
got
have
two and a
time
half
to,
year
I really try. This is, like I said, and this is number 8 for Mirage. And every single time I try to do one, I'm like, I'm going to read Terry Pratchett. And I break it. I download a Terry
old.
Pratchett and I lay on the couch when I pick up my kids and I read it. And my son comes over, blah, blah, blah. And he takes my phone from me. And I try to read Frankenstein. He did the same exact thing. I try to download it, an audio version. Or actually, if you go to YouTube, they have audio versions of Frankenstein. So I'm like, oh, you know what?
Oh
This is
yeah,
like,
you'll go for a walk and you'll listen to it because you're gonna have, 3 hours to yourself. I
but
know
it
how
doesn't
that
work that
goes.
way.
No.
It doesn't work
No,
that way.
but you
But
know what? A lot of the sort of cultural icons that we know about Frankenstein are true, whether you've read it or not. And I mean, sometimes, they're just those books you
no,
just don't read.
that was
Everybody
what I was
tells you to
thinking.
read them,
Yeah,
and everybody says, "Oh, you've got to read this," and it's just those classics. And it's like, I mean, like I'll confess something to you.
Dracula.
I've read Dracula many times, but I have never read Jane Eyre.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, and like everybody who meets me says, "Oh, you must be a huge, you must love Jane Eyre and all that, all those kind of books." And I'm like, "Oh,
Because you're
I
a
can't."
writer.
Because I'm a woman, probably,
Oh,
and
because
because I'm
you're
a
a
little bit
woman.
of a goth. I don't know, and it's not that it's not good writing. It's just I feel like the era for that in my life has come and gone. But I
I
hold
say the
out.
same
Right.
thing, honestly. In terms of literature, I think the era has come and gone. I mean, in terms of Mary Shelley, the time has come and gone as well. The way she was writing, and when I was doing a little research before I got on the phone with you, she wasn't just writing Gothic fiction either. She was trying to find her voice, and she was writing historical novels, and she was writing something that's not even recognizable on Wikipedia called Godwinian novels. I mean, you can't even find an exact definition of what that is. And
Well, one very interesting thing to think of with Mary Shelley, and I would argue with you that I do think I think she is timeless. And I was just going to say I know someday you will read this book and you'll say, oh, because it does actually, you're a writer, and if you've ever read any horror novel, you will read this and realize what an influence it has had on
there's a
writing
pedigree,
in general.
right? That's what I'm saying. There's a pedigree there from the mid 18th, 19th century to now. There is a pedigree that writers have spawned from, have taken
Whether
from
you'll
her.
admit it or not, it's almost because the odds are you've read something that has been influenced by the concepts that she talks about and the
That's my
genre
point.
of fiction that
Absolutely.
she has created. So,
And
and
that's the
it could be
problem for
Stephen
me.
King that you're reading, but
Is
you're
the
getting.
familiarity is there. It's going to be there. You've touched it. And like you said just a moment ago, that I feel a familiarity with Frankenstein because I've seen it so often in so many different things
Yes,
that
we
you're
love
spoiled
him.
already for
We
it.
love
Like,
Frankenstein's monster, we should say. We love the creature.
yes,
We're gonna be.
we love the monster
It's
and the inventor and Igor. I mean, you know all these characters so well because they've been played out so many different
Oh,
ways.
fun fact,
You're,
Igor does not exist in the book.
why is that a trope?
And I think it was just something that was added in as a, oh, give him this funny little hunchback assistant. But I
Where
did
does it
want to.
come from, though? Because I mean, that is like you have Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, you have the monster, and then you have Igor. Where does that come from? Because they're like synonymous.
Right. And we also call, it's now generally accepted to say Frankenstein, and um, we know that we're talking about the monster. We're not talking about Dr. Frankenstein. And the diehards will say, well, you mean Frankenstein's monster or the
So
creature
funny.
or it, as he is often referred to in the book, that abominable thing. But there are characters in the book that I think kind of became a little bit like sort of the basis. Like there's a Victor Frankenstein, who is Dr. Frankenstein, has a couple of people that influence him. And one of them is a professor of chemistry who kind of talks to him about, the bigger questions of life, and kind of gets his interest going in the idea of like sort of reanimation or whatever it is.
Hmm.
But it's not the Igor as we know it. And, you could get into a lot of reasons why that might be. I mean, having that sort of like, I mean, he's almost comic relief.
No, you're right. And I just looked it up. It's Hollywood. It's Hollywood
Yeah, it's
fast forward.
Hollywood, right, of course. But I mean, it's
In
like a little bit of
1930s,
comic relief.
1940s, it's
Yeah.
totally a character added in there for
Add this
comic
little
relief.
like guy that shuffles along and has a
Yeah,
signature thing like, walk this way or after me. And then, the that kind of idea of like, it's like a little, he needed a sidekick, I guess. He
I
needed a
guess.
sidekick. And
What
that's
do you
fine. I
call
have no
that?
problem with that sidekick
I don't
at
either
all.
because it's become a trope. It's become something that I guess it's become a literature of movies in a way. I mean,
Sure. Well, I was going to say just going back to sort of like Mary Shelley and the publication and we're just sort of talking about being a struggling writer and she I read this recently, although I'm sure it's been common knowledge for all the scholars out there, but the very first edition of Frankenstein, when it came out, was published anonymously, and it had a foreword by her, by Percy Bysshe Shelley. So it actually didn't name her name because she wasn't known then, and it was met with great success. And so not long after that, it was republished and her name was put on it. And
mhm.
that's sort of interesting because it also ties in with the story, the origin story of how Frankenstein was created, and some of the other stories that came out of that, including a novel called The Vampire, which was the first vampire novel published in English, which was written by a guy named I think it was John William Polidori. I know his last name was Polidori, and he was Lord Byron's personal assistant. And Byron and Shelley were friends, and Mary Shelley, I mean, when I say Shelley, I mean Percy Bysshe Shelley. And so they would all hang out. And that night when this, we can get into this sort of origin of it, but that night when the stories were said to be created, or that week when they were all sort of summering in Geneva and Lake Geneva, this vampire story was born out of that, and it's said that it was actually Percy Bysshe Shelley's idea, but Polidori took the idea with his permission and published it. So many people, when that novel was published, thought that it was Percy Bysshe Shelley, and it was met with great criticism, and they thought he had just put another name on it and didn't believe the whole Polidori origin story. And so at the same time, this kind of happened. Perhaps that's why they chose to do Mary Shelley anonymously. Also, she was a woman,
Yeah.
and her name was very obviously a woman. So it's just kind of an interesting little side note about sort of what was happening in publishing and that genre at the time.
Do you know anything about Percy? Was he successful as a poet?
Yes, he was already a
He was,
success as a
right?
poet then. Yes, he
Because I
was.
mean, you can't summer on Lake Geneva. I mean, so that's
Yeah,
pretty
he didn't hang out
pretty
with Lord Byron and
prestigious.
stuff. You're
Yeah.
already on the inner circle. So and they were not. I can't remember if they were married at the time because Percy had a wife who actually
Commit
committed
suicide. Yeah.
suicide, and that actually allowed Mary Shelley and Percy to be together and to get married. But they were already seeing each other, and I believe they may have actually already had a son that had died by miscarriage. And what's interesting is I like to do this because I'm a weirdo, but just before you called, I just grabbed my copy of the book and I just sort of flipped open to see where I would land. Did a little bit of bibliomancy, and I fell upon this sort of.
Bibliomancy. My God, I love that. That is such a great word. Is that an actual word? I love
Yeah,
that so
it's an
much.
actual word, and it means basically divination through a book or through a work of literature. So you might ask yourself a question and then flip your book, and when you feel it's time to stop, you point and you stop and you point at that page, and therein there may be an answer or some sort of something interesting that you should learn that day, or some kind of answer to your life's greatest question, depending on
Fantastic.
what. I mean, you do it with a graphic novel. I can't The Walking Dead or something. I can't promise you're going to find your path, but the
Yeah.
world needs more Rick Grimes that could come up. So, but what came up actually, and just for anyone who's not read the story, much like Bram Stoker's Dracula, the story is told through a series of letters. And there are letters throughout in which different characters are writing back and forth to each other. And Elizabeth is the fiancée of Dr. Frankenstein. And he's off doing his work. And so she is writing to him with updates. And one of the passage that I fell upon was this part of a story where the character Elizabeth is talking about some people who have passed away, and specifically these two sort of orphan children that have come to them. And one is not really an orphan. His name is William, and he is Dr. Frankenstein's youngest beloved young brother. And she sort of describes him and this, with great joy and great detail. But she says one thing in here about one of the women, her aunt died, and someone basically thinking, I'm just trying to find the quote right now because I flipped it open and now of course I can't find it, but basically the quote is that she feels that she is being punished by that all the death around her. It means that she is being punished, and she's a good Catholic, and so she is judging herself and feeling as though God is judging her and delivering this death because she is not doing a good job, or she is not being a good person. This is all the character, but I flipped that and I thought that is something that Mary Shelley was wrestling with throughout much of her life. And being a feminist, a very early feminist, who was the daughter of a feminist who died actually when Mary Shelley was just shortly after she was born. Sort of having this kind of constantly wrestling, plus the times, right? It's the mid 1800s. There's or early 1800s. There's some ideas of sort of like new waves of thinking, but you're steeped in tradition, and women still had very few options for what they could do with their lives and with their careers. And most of it had to do with the men that they chose to associate with. And so she chooses some sin, technically, right? She chooses to be with a man who's married. She chooses to live this non-conventional sort of the heathenistic literary lifestyle, and by sort of the framework of society at the time. And she wrestled with that idea that perhaps she was being punished. I mean, her Percy's wife commits suicide. Her sister commits suicide. She has multiple miscarriages. They actually end up only having one child that survives into adulthood between her and Percy. And so this whole idea of punishment and God and life versus death, I mean, that all actually just poured out into that novel, and it was a way for her to say all the things that she was feeling without really getting arrested for it, essentially. So there's that.
Oh, that's very interesting. The feminist ideas also back then, in terms of when she died too. She died in 1851.
Yeah.
She never didn't really get any freedom in terms of that. And I mean, when was feminism in England? The early 20th century, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that in the book that I just wrote that will be out next October touches on this a little bit, and it's a topic that I like to explore, and that is sort of like, again, what the position of women at the time, and the sort of the paths that women took, and specifically in the world of the literary arts, and that sort of crossover into horror, or in the book that I wrote, I'm kind of talking about women with their limited kind of choices often going into mediumship. And right toward Mary Shelley died in the mid 1800s, and in the very, very late 1800s, late Victorian and early kind of 1900s, that was the rise of spiritualism. And spiritualism was a movement in which people believed that they could communicate with the dead. And that's when you had, people always had traditions, have always had traditions and ways to communicate with the dead. Not saying it just started suddenly, but in terms of it becoming, especially in the society that Mary Shelley was from, in England and in the United States, especially, and parts of Europe, the spiritualist movement sort of gave rise to, those are the parlor games, those are the spirit boards, communing with the dead, gave way to charlatans saying, your husband told me that you should give me all your money, to legitimate kind of experiences that people were having, and a new way of looking at life after death. That sort of came out of, not really so much in her lifetime, but I think the concepts that she talks about with the reanimation and the resurrection of, corpses into this kind of like monster man, some of those things were common talk in society, and she certainly, and that's, I think, why her novel was successful. Also, it's really, really good. And is a really good read, and very, very well written. She's very talented. But I think that all kind of gave way. The Victorians were very interested in like mourning and mourning wear. And so that sort of gave way to this spiritualist movement, in which, there are several famous women who channeled material in order to become famous poets at a time when, it was just starting to become acceptable to be a woman that wasn't married, or maybe you were married, but you didn't identify solely through your husband.
Who was writing at the time of Mary Shelley? She was alone, wasn't she? Nobody else was writing fiction like she was writing Frankenstein. Nobody else
No,
produced a work like she did.
not
I'm talking
really.
about a woman. I'm talking about another female writer.
Well, there were some female writers that were writing more sort of like short stories. Let me think. So there was sort of a whole collection of writers who worked a lot with I want to say Mark Twain, but not Mark Twain. Worked with Charles Dickens. Yeah, Mark Twain was. I was thinking of this woman who channeled a Mark Twain novel, and that's kind of why he was in my head. But
yeah, I was thinking about her too, but then I changed it because he died in like the whenever Halley's Comet went through.
He died in the 20s. Yeah. So
20s.
but at the time, okay, so like Dracula didn't come out until I don't know, 45 years after Mary Shelley died, or 46 years after Mary Shelley died, or something like that. But there were a group of people who wrote with Charles Dickens. Actually, Charles Dickens had, not to sidebar too far, but this does tie in. Stay with me. Charles Dickens, I think it's not a real surprise if you think about it, that he was rather obsessed with ghosts and sort of the afterlife. And
but none of them ever really got the acclaim that she did. If you're thinking about
absolutely not. Absolutely
none, right?
not.
They always were going to be either like, even if they did write a book, the man in their life probably would have taken that book to the publisher and said, "Look what I did," because they would have had ownership of everything the woman had, right? And the woman wouldn't have had a foot to stand on.
Yeah, that was probably the point at which things were maybe shifting away from that a little bit, as far as like women having property and things like that. I don't really know exactly what the structure was in England at the time, but there definitely was like, she would have been successful had Percy Bysshe Shelley been involved or not. But having that sort of edge did propel
Harriet
her forward.
Beecher Stowe. Uncle
Sure.
Tom's Cabin, maybe,
Sure.
right? That's
Right. So
one
that's
name
not
out of
horror fiction, though.
no, it's just an author. It's so sad. It's
Well,
really
you have
sad.
women like you have George Eliot. I believe she was writing around that time, but she was writing under the name George Eliot, which was, obviously something that, was like, oh, well, actually, no, that's not necessarily a woman.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of women. They're certainly not as well known. That's for
When did
sure.
Frankenstein actually take off, do you think? Like, was it immediate success
I believe
without
it
her
was
name on the cover?
fairly immediate. Yeah, I think it was fairly immediate. Now, if I remember right, it was published first with this um, with this kind of idea that it was published anonymously. So I feel like that was probably in like the 18, I want to say 1818 is when it was first published. Um, so it was fairly quickly. I mean, what happened is it was published anonymously, but it had this foreword by Shelley. So it was kind of like, oh, this guy, we know this guy. So I mean, it's just that happens today, right? You get a foreword by someone fancy, and your book is going to shoot up higher on Amazon immediately because you have that author association. So that's why you want someone fancy to say your book is great.
Hmm.
But I mean, to my understanding, it actually took off fairly quickly. She never really had the success that she had with that later. It never really kind of went. She did do she had other works, but she never really had the success. And what is especially rare about her, and especially in terms of female authors, she met tremendous success in her lifetime, and that is many. I mean, even you look at like even Laura Ingalls Wilder, for example. She wrote all those Little House on the Prairie books, and she wrote those in the late 1800s, early 1900s, long after the things that had happened took place. She wrote them as an older woman. She was in her, I think, 60s when she was writing some of those books.
Hmm.
But she never really saw I mean, they were popular, but she never really saw in her lifetime the enduring success
Yeah.
that, they weren't that popular. And I mean, they were, pretty well known, but Frankenstein was a different thing. And it actually sparked a lot of, conversations and
Through
controversy.
centuries. I mean, through for the last 170 years, 60 years, 67
Right,
years. I mean, it's just
right.
amazing the how long that novel has lasted. And the sad thing to me, the really, really depressing thing, if she had put her name on it, it would have gone away. I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and the unfortunate thing is she had put Mary Shelley on that novel, she would have been ridiculed and probably laughed out of town or something along those lines. I mean, I wonder if it would have been.
Possibly, but I don't know if she would have cared.
No, well, the world would have, though, unfortunately, and we would not have Frankenstein. We wouldn't have Igor. We wouldn't have the monster. I would not have, the joy of walking through a haunted house and being scared by, you know,
This
the monster.
thing that
Yeah,
moans.
I mean,
Yeah. Well,
all the
it's
tropes. I
true.
mean, the
Yeah.
thing. I mean, it's just we have the culture that we have has been influenced by this woman in the 1820s by being brave enough to write a novel and put a name on it that wasn't hers. That's the saddest part. But she did, and so many other people probably did the same thing, but we don't know what their stories were.
I often wonder who advised her of that. I have never really found much information about that, but who advised her to not put her name on there? I think it was
That's an
just sort of
interesting question,
known, like, yeah, if anybody out there knows, write to us. We'd
right?
love to know.
That would be a
Because
question
it
for
was
an answer
no
too.
doubt a publisher who said, well, we won't put a woman's name on this. No one's going to buy it. And then all these people bought it, and then they put a woman's name on it, and they continued to buy it. And actually, it's never gone out of print. That's a fun fact about Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's never gone out of print since 18, I think 18. But what is interesting also is that, she did have success with this. And it definitely goes along those lines of there's no such thing as bad publicity, because there were a lot of people that were horrified by it, horrified by the ideas that she was proposing, horrified by, the very genre itself. I mean, the idea that a woman would even be writing about these kinds of things, you know, certainly very led to a great deal of criticism. But nonetheless, you know, I am completely speculating here.
On
But
speculative
on,
fiction.
on speculative fiction. But I think about what sort of measure of success did she actually feel? Because to her, so many people close to her were constantly dying, including Percy Bysshe Shelley, who died of a
Yeah.
horrible accident. I mean, he drowned. And not long after Frankenstein was out. I mean, it wasn't, they hadn't really had, it was maybe 4 years or something. So throughout her life, regardless of what critical acclaim, was she ever really able to find satisfaction in that? Because part of her, at least, I mean, as demonstrated by the words she writes in her novel, that, you know, she's like, feels she's being punished somehow and is always doubting her own life choices, which is probably the mark of a true artist, right? Any tortured artist or writer will tell you that they really don't think they're as good as everyone else thinks they are. I mean, no one thinks that. You're always like, ugh, I sound like that, or, oh, I wrote that. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of the forever thing that,
Self-doubt.
yeah. So, I mean, and then you imagine being an actual successful woman, but also under great criticism during the time. And one other woman who was sort of popular during that time, but is not well known, was a woman, and we may have talked about this on the previous show, but there was a woman named Ida Craddock, and she was known for distributing materials to women. This just gives you an idea of what life was like for women. They had no idea what to expect on their wedding night. They went into this marriage,
Yes, we did speak of her. Yeah, that's
yeah. So
interesting.
what to expect? And her just to recap, she distributed materials, not super graphic, like, insert A into B. It wasn't like that. It was like, here's sort of how to behave, and, bathe yourself in this way. And these are, she didn't get into like the goriest of details, but she gave women some kind of clue as to what to expect, and that there may be pain, and that, and she wasn't radical. She didn't say only do what gives you pleasure. She said, do what your husband wants, basically. Now, she was persecuted just for distributing that material to kind of alleviate women's fears, and was institutionalized because of it, and actually ended up taking her own life rather than be institutionalized for the remaining. I mean, she was like 30 or something when this was happening. So this is kind of the climate that I mean, this was a little later. This was post, it was probably like she was alive during the same time as Mary Shelley, but Mary Shelley died in 1851, I think. So,
You know what I find funny about that is that there are organizations in this country now that are still being persecuted for trying to help women with their
oh, yeah,
their sexual health and
yeah.
reproductive
Do you
organs.
know the name of the organization? It was called the Society for the Suppression of Moral Vice. And I swear to God, that's like, it probably still exists in somewhere. It's just unbelievable. So that's a sidebar that really doesn't have anything too much to do with Mary Shelley, but we, just in
But we're
terms of,
talking about feminism. We really
yeah.
are, because this is a woman who was being persecuted by um uh, I'm gonna mispronounce the word. I'm not gonna even try. What is it? The hegemon. How do you say it?
Hegemons? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about a horrible society that is keeping people down. I mean, it's a racist society, it's a sexist society, and we're living in the tail end of that society now, and it's
Oh,
unfortunate.
sure. Absolutely. I mean, it has colored everything from the laws that are on the books to, the murals on the wall in the White House. I mean, these things are all, still in effect. We have totally different ideas, and we have, amazing new generations that are able to look beyond this and really work beyond it. But I mean, women couldn't vote until the 20s. I
Yeah.
mean, that's not that long ago,
Yeah,
that it's
I
kind of,
that's the sad thing to me is you think that there are generations getting beyond it, but
you
that
think,
doesn't seem to be likely. Then you look at what's happening politically in the country, and it's like there's still a shift. There's
yeah,
still a
but
shift, like
those
50-50.
generations aren't old enough to vote yet. Or, I mean, I really do think there's a lot of children, and your children will be a part of this generation, who view gender completely differently. I mean, my own son, my nieces and nephews, they don't look at gender and race in the way, they don't look at a boy wearing a dress in the same way. I mean, they have new words. I had to get schooled on the new words for what I would have said was androgyny, and my niece schooled me. She said, "That's not, you don't
Is it
say that."
hegemony? It's not hegemony. Hegemony. And I
It's so
want to
funny
say
you're obsessed
hegemony
about that.
so
Did I say
bad,
that
but
right?
it's
That is actually how I would say it, but I will tell you something. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say the word.
right. I'm like one of those people who read all the time, but
You know what? That's
like
the sign of a truly intelligent person. I read that quote once that said, "Never make fun of someone who mispronounces a word, because it means they read it before they heard anyone see it or say it."
yeah, that's what I've
So,
heard too. But I
but I
really
would have
just want
said
to
it
say
the same
hegemony
way.
or hegemony. No, maybe it's hegemony. We'll
Hegemony.
just
No,
go
I
with
like
hegemony.
hegemony. Let's go with that. Sounds delightful. It sounds like a nice side dish you'd serve at a pub.
Right.
But let's
Well,
remember too that Mary Shelley, um, is the daughter of a woman, Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a pioneer and who did write. I mean, she wrote a book. It was called "A Vindication of the Rights of Women," and that was published in 1792, before our Mary Shelley was ever born. And like I said, she didn't have the influence of her mother as a presence in her life, but the legacy of her mother and her mother's work was
man, her mother
was
died
known
at
throughout the
38 years old.
world. What's that?
Her mother died at 38.
Yeah, her mother died very young, and I think she died as from like an infection from childbirth, because it was very soon after Mary Shelley was born.
And this is a
So
time where if you have a portrait done of you, you're very rich. And Mary Shelley had a portrait, her father had a portrait, her mother had a portrait, her son had a caricature drawn of him, and everybody in his family had portraits.
right. I mean, we're not even really getting into we're talking there are different waves of her mother was well off enough to be an advocate of women's rights. If you were a scullery maid, you didn't have time to become a philosopher and learn new ideas. You basically were scrubbing what people told you to scrub. And so you do have some classism in that sort of rise of feminism and the spreading of ideas. And but you see that throughout history, of course. I mean, that's the education is what helps improve things. Now, some people have that natural instinct for what is right and what is wrong, and they know it's not supposed to be that way. They may not have the power to do anything about that. And someone like her mother did have the power, and she did do something about that, and she was actually quite ridiculed and disliked for it. So that's the
The poor
stuff that
woman died
Mary
of
Shelley
sepsis
came from.
giving birth to Mary.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
horrible. I mean, what a way to be born. That's like one of those nightmare situations. You're a child that kills its mother. I mean, that's how you're born. That's the first moment in life you have is you killed your mother being born.
Yeah, I mean, I guess she had a difficult delivery, and then the ultimately she died. I think it was within like 2 or 3 weeks. So the odds are, if she was ill that whole time, she probably was not even held by her mother. I mean, that chances are she wasn't cradled in her mother's arms as a tiny baby, because her mother was probably feverish and not feeling well, and she was probably whisked away to the nursemaid or something.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, you have that you're wrestling with, and you definitely have this idea of could you and would you bring someone back? Would you, if you had the ability to bring someone back to life, would you do that?
And ultimately, what's the bottom line with Frankenstein? He's brought back to life, And the beginning of the novel is Dr. Frankenstein is going on a search for the monster, right? And he's
Right.
gone
So
to search for himself. He's trying to find his
what's
soul.
happened? Right. So what's happened is, the novel sort of starts out telling you sort of the end.
Spoiler alert.
I mean, sort of. And basically, Dr. Frankenstein is found freezing in the tundra, and by the sea
Of
captain.
Russia, right? I mean, he's gone to
Yeah, I
St.
think.
Petersburg or Moscow, one of the
Yeah,
two.
yes, and he's gone. What he has done is he's gone in search of the creature. So Dr. Frankenstein is in search of the creature, and now the creature has gone rogue. He created him and sort of worked with him for a while and had conversations, and they sort of kind of tried to work on a relationship, I guess. And then the creature just feels, the creature has feelings, something that Dr. Frankenstein didn't account for. And the creature asks him, this is kind of the whole crux, is the creature asks him to create, this is where we get Bride of Frankenstein, he asks him to create a companion. He says, I want you to create me a companion. It's not, I can never be with a regular person. I'm a monster. Make me a monster bride. I know you can do it because you made me. And so Dr. Frankenstein starts to do it. And he's sort of, wrestling with the idea the whole time because he can't believe what a horrific, like, evil thing he's already created. And so there he is trying to create evil thing number two. And he ends up having, a moral crisis over it. A little late for that. But he has this moral crisis and he destroys the created bride. So he actually kind of gets her and stitches her together and all of that. And the monster's looking in the window and sees this and sees him destroy it. And so then in turn, the monster goes, and I can't remember who he kills first, but he kills his beloved little brother. So he kills this little boy, William. And I think he ends up, he kills Elizabeth too. I mean, basically the monster goes on a rampage in revenge. And it's like he doesn't quite stop him in time, and then the monster disappears. And so now Dr. Frankenstein has unleashed this evil thing in the world. It's like the atom bomb, really, right? It's like, oops, wait, what did we create? Wait, no, now it's out there. No, let's get it back. Let's talk about peace. Let's get it back in here. Get it back in the lab. Well, it's too late. It's already, being used for weapons and melting people around the world. So there's definitely like that kind of, that idea that sort of repeats itself in history. In any case, yeah, he's trying to find him, and the end of the novel, they don't find him. It's just like Dr. Frankenstein, dies a shivery death and tells this sea captain his tale, and then that's how the story is retold to us through the sea captain.
Did she ever speak of her novel?
Yes.
Like, she ever go to any Comic-Cons and sit on a panel?
Yeah, the equivalent of Comic-Con. Like whatever that would be.
Whatever the 19th century, mid-19th century version of that was.
Yeah, I mean, I think she wrote some critical essays on it, and she certainly, had correspondence. I don't know if she did a lot of public events. She was also somewhat sick throughout much of her adulthood, so she wasn't exactly the healthiest person. And I think she did speak in like the sort of the literary circles that she was already kind of part of with Percy. But I mean, I don't know how much touring she did speaking about the novel. I mean, she certainly got money for it.
I mean, how do you know?
How do I know that she got money for it?
Yeah. I mean, she was already wealthy. She was wealthy through her parents. She was wealthy through her husband. She was wealthy because her child didn't have to, it doesn't look like her child did anything. If you look at him, he looked like a little, dude.
Well,
type of guy.
I guess I am making that assumption that she received money for it because she continued to write and wrote again for the same publisher. And so if you weren't receiving royalties, you wouldn't do that. I mean, that was sort of like the foundation of publishing even back then, was that you got a portion of the proceeds. So
Their son was appointed High Sheriff of Sussex in 1865.
that I
He
did not
appeared
know.
he appeared in Men of the Day series and Vanity Fair in 1879 as the poet's son, a caricature by Ape. I don't know what that is. But he delights above all in yachting and in private theatricals, and even now engaged in building a theater for amateur performers. And he is a gentleman.
Was, so they say.
And prestigious and exclusive Royal Yachting Squadron. So I don't know whether or not you can be a professional yachting squadron at Cowes on the Isle of Wight.
Well, he certainly didn't want for anything, but keep in mind that, they were both from fairly well-off families and were both successful and made their own money. And he was their only heir because he was their only surviving child.
And that's
So
my
he
point.
certainly had,
I mean, the world was definitely changing when he died in 1889 at 70 years old. And she died at 53. And I guess you said I think the husband died after her.
Percy Bysshe Shelley? No, he died he died just only a few years after.
No, you're right. My apologies. He died at 20.
Yeah. No, that was like another big
nail.
Well, it was just another big loss in her life. I mean, she was surrounded by death. So it's not a big surprise that, someone who is surrounded by death would be kind of, obsessed with that idea and obsessed with, the life after death, or what we now call, I mean, she kind of, the genre didn't really exist, of this sort of like Gothic horror idea. It didn't really exist then. And I don't know if someone had said to her, hey, you're going to be a famous horror writer. I don't know that she thought of it as horror. I think she thought of it as fiction. I mean, she was very influenced by, the other.
Who else was writing that? Like you said, there's nobody else writing this type of work then. I mean, what do you have? Cervantes writing a fantasy piece in Shakespeare's day, a couple hundred years before this, kind of blending psychotic, kind of mental blah, blah, blah. And nothing really happened to me after that, where you have like the fakeness.
Right. And I think from her point of view, I mean, she was like, Paradise Lost plays into the book a lot, and the creature actually reads of it and she quotes of it. So I think in her mind, she was probably thinking of it more along the lines of like a work of a literary work that tells sort of like a tale, more of like a moral tale, like you dabble in this and this is what happens to you. So I mean, that seems to be like, probably as far as literary goes, she was kind of talking about
A morality tale.
A morality tale. Yeah. So I think, and that was influenced by, this epic poem that was celebrated in God. Yeah, don't mess with God, and Satan is, Satan is real and doing things, and
her mom is Dr. Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, I never really thought of it like that. Like, her mom is the one that's sort of like creating this thing. I was thinking more that she was Dr. Frankenstein, that she and herself, this is how she was paying tribute to these people who had died in her life, was by resurrecting them in this novel in some way. Now, I am not enough of an expert to compare the characters to real life people. I don't know enough about the peripheral people in her life, but I have read a few essays and articles, and probably a foreword to one of the versions of Frankenstein that I'd read that talks about that, about like who these people may have been in her real life. The little boy was her little boy that actually survived. The girl, things like that. So I'm sure that I mean, any writer does that, right?
Yeah.
So you've got kind of, and that would be an excellent dissertation if anybody's looking for ideas out there.
So I mean, the lineage is over with, though. I mean, there is no more Shelleys. There are no more Frankenstein families out there right now. Unfortunately, like the Lincolns, they are gone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure someone would lay claim through, like, as a cousin or something. I'm sure there's some living descendants on, like, through her mother's side or something like that. But yeah, they only had the one, and then I don't know if he ever reproduced. But
It doesn't seem like it. Oh, I'm
I
looking at
don't.
Wikipedia right now.
Oh yeah, well, that's moderately reliable, but I don't
A
really. I
hundred
know
percent.
it's edited by the people.
I'm editing it right now, taking out stuff.
This isn't true. Yeah, it gives license to anyone. Um, yeah. So I mean, I think about that. That is a question I think about, and I think everybody has their own opinions, and that's how it should be when you read a novel. Because let's remember, we are talking about a novel of fiction. That what you see and what you get out of it is subjective, completely and utterly subjective. And whether you know nothing about Mary Shelley, as I did when I first started reading it, or you know some stuff, which now that I've read it 10 times and been interested in it, I know some stuff. I'm certainly not a lifelong scholar, and I didn't, do a dissertation, although it's such a good idea to do that. I never really occurred to me. But you have,
I
it's
think your
one of
knowledge
those.
warrants it. I mean, I wonder if you're looking to get a PhD or a master's degree.
Does
This might be a
anybody
perfect.
want to give me an honorary one based on my somewhat, bootstrap knowledge of Mary Shelley? Anyone out there? I'll
University of
take an honorary
Minnesota.
degree. Yeah. But again, I'll just go back to the fact that, I mean, for me, I have read this at different times in my life. I read it as a very young child. I read it as a teenager. That may have been what had influenced me more than anything, was reading it as a teenager, when you are really trying to find your way in the world and you feel so much angst and anxiety. At least I did as a teenager. I mean, I was angst ridden. And to read about a character who, wants to tear his own body from limb to limb because he's tortured, you are immediately like, oh, wow, someone like 200 years ago wrote that. Like, wow, somebody else gets it. To then, as I became a more serious writer and started developing my own writing voice, reading it again and getting something else out of it, eventually just, seeing the literary devices, or non-devices that are in there, and starting to realize, what it is. So I feel like it's one of those books. For me, it's sort of a hallmark of where I am in my life. And Dracula's kind of the same. I'll reread that. I mean, honestly, it's like I forgot everything that happened in it when I'm reading it again. I'm like,
Yeah.
what's going to happen? Oh, what's going to happen? Like, I don't know. I mean, it's that absorbing for me. I know that might sound a little dingbatty, but I mean, it's one of those kind of novels that does that. And I think
These
other
things are
people.
so pervasive in our culture too. And how about this? The creation walks into the snowstorm, the tundra basically, which is kind of like the coldness of death, with the creator kind of walking behind it, disappearing.
Well, what I love about the ending is that, I mean, if she had written that today, she would already have book deal number 2 for the sequel, because she left it open ended. Now, she didn't do that so she could make a sequel. She didn't leave this open end. She left it because, she wanted to sort of haunt us with that idea that the monster is still out there. Will he ever
Wasn't there kind
die?
of an eternal life type of aspect to the monster at the end of Frankenstein? Like it's going to live forever. Did I get that?
Well, I think you can get that out of that because, you just reanimated a corpse, or parts of a corpse. You created something, and you have no idea what its real life expectancy is going to be. And you don't know how to kill it. You don't know that you can. I mean, it's basically superhuman So literally you have created a monster. I mean, that's where it comes from. You've created a monster. And they're really, the idea is that once you unleash an idea like that, or something so evil or something so powerful into the world, it's out of your hands. It's out of the hands of the scientists. And keep in mind also at the time, what was happening on the scientific front, where there was a lot of experimentation, there was a lot of developing knowledge based on, some of it based on grave robbery and being able to get a hold of a corpse. But
Yeah.
medical knowledge was advancing at a very great rate during the 1800s, more so than it ever had. And there was less of this like, oh, this is a spiritual ailment, and more of this like, actually, this guy's heart is got this funny color in it, and we think it's this. I mean, they're dissecting people to find, not living people, but dissecting corpses to find out and learn about the human body in a way that we did not know. And so there were great medical advances happening at the same time, which a lot of people were opposed to.
Well, guys, we did touch all these dead bodies. Let's go deliver some babies now without washing our hands.
Well, and the morality of that in the medical profession and the scientific profession of, I mean, today still it's there, testing on animals, because you want to make sure that, you're testing on this monkey over and over again to make sure that it doesn't have a reaction in humans, because you don't test on humans. Well, actually we do. We sign up for a voluntary study and you get $200 and an extra beard or whatever, but you have
Did you say extra beard?
extra beard, a little, a little extra fuzz going on,
That sounds good.
You never know what they're
I
getting.
want an extra hipster beard.
But you signed a waiver, so it'll be okay. But I mean, at the time, right, you have, you have people who know that they can advance the medical profession by looking at it in one way, and wrestling with the fact that a lot of these corpses that are appearing at this school in Edinburgh are, grave robbed. And
Yeah.
you're not the doctors aren't going into the graveyard and digging up the corpses, but the poor guy on the street who you're paying to do it is doing it, and very discreetly sort of shuffling it in the back alley and bringing it in. And it's a teaching tool. And so you have that sort of like morality is like, can we do this? People still have it today, people that don't want autopsies, or they don't want to be an organ donor because they don't, I'm not waging a judgment on that, but you don't want that person cut up. You still believe that there's a part of them in that. Versus
I don't want to be
the body.
full of chemicals when I die. I want to be buried naturally, or committed to the flow of energy within the earth, or something along those lines. I mean, it's all kind of connected, right?
Yeah, wrapped in a nice silken shroud and stuck at the foot of a tree.
Yeah. It's amazing though. She's writing within the environment in which she's living. She's not really recreating the world around her. She's writing within her environment.
Well, isn't that
That's
why
it's fiction for her, isn't it? It's not that she's trying to write science fiction. She's writing fiction.
Right.
She's writing about
science
grave
fiction
robbers.
wasn't so much of even a genre then either. It was like, okay, this can be thought of as science fiction because they are talking about some scientific theories and using electricity for animation.
Because electricity did animate you. In fact, if you think about it, it does. If I die, if I collapse right now and have a heart attack, I'll 911. They are going to animate my heart with electricity.
Right. And they
It's
were
not
doing
fiction.
tests like that on corpses to see if it would work during the era in which she started writing about it. So that was happening, and that has developed into, the medical technology that we have today. But I mean, that's herein lies the beauty of fiction and writers, and why writers are so valuable in the world, because they can speak out in a way and influence culture in a way that cannot be, I mean, obviously people can ban your book and burn your book, but it cannot really be suppressed. You cannot change a writer's words. If you do that, it's not their words anymore. So, and
they do that to Shakespeare all the time though, and they still call it Shakespeare.
Well,
they rewrite him.
Interpretation. You have to be careful when you get into like, there's reinvention and the modern Shakespeare, but you're not going to be publishing. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess so. You're not going to be publishing something and saying this is you have to find something that says it's the original works, right? And Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you'll find graphic novels. You'll find a lot of different versions of it. You'll find board books if you want to introduce your 2.5-year-olds to it. There's a board book version of Frankenstein.
I have
So,
Oedipus, and I have Oedipus. I have the Odyssey upstairs. It's
oh,
the
nice.
worst board. I know it's the worst thing ever.
Oh, the board book.
It's
Oh, is it part of that same series where they have like Frankenstein and Dracula and Alice in Wonderland? And it's sort of like literary board books.
yeah, it is
Yeah.
literary
It's
board
basically
books.
a
It's
picture with a thing.
so bad. It's
Well, the
so bad.
Frankenstein one's kind of cute, I think, but I'm biased because I love anything that is
Oh,
even
I love this one. I
bastardized or
would
otherwise.
love this.
Yeah.
I would love this so much, except there's just a series of monsters, which is great, but there's no story to it. It's backwards too, and it's like, oh my God. Come on, guys, put a little
This
effort
isn't
into
even
your
how
board
it
books.
goes. Well, it just shows that you've read it. So you
know what I don't get
teachable
though?
moment. Teachable
What's that?
moment.
I'm sorry.
It's a teachable moment for your kids.
So we just go through the pictures and I say, which is Daddy's favorite? They don't get it. I like the Cyclops.
Oh, I love the Cyclops. Yeah, Cyclops, good.
They always skip past it. And I said, which is your favorite? They don't have a favorite yet. Like, come on, guys, play with me here. You know what I don't get though? Maybe you can help me out here. Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus? Prometheus is the Greek god who created humans, right? But Frankenstein created a monster. Is Shelley saying that humans are monsters?
Well, you have to keep in mind that Frankenstein is the doctor. Frankenstein is the creator. Now when we hear, right? So Frankenstein is not the creature, although now it is generally accepted. If you were to say to me in casual conversation, Frankenstein, I would know that you're talking about the monster, and I wouldn't correct you and say, oh, you mean Frankenstein's monster or the creature? Right.
But the same Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus, and Prometheus created humans, and Frankenstein created the monster. So is Shelley suggesting that Frankenstein created a monster? Did Prometheus create humans? Are humans monsters?
Oh, probably. I mean, I never really thought about it like that. I never really went down that path. But absolutely, you could see a little criticism there of her saying, and that man or that god that created humans was also creating a monster, because look at what we're capable of. But I always just kind of thought it of as a way to let people know that this is, the doctor has created life from nothing, from something that wasn't alive.
But Prometheus also gave humans fire, though, too. But Prometheus also gave humans fire.
Yes, and Mary Shelley has has electricity as sort of like the fire kind of element of it, I think. But I kind of feel that it was more about saying this is this, so that right off the bat that this is a creation novel, that this is a novel about someone who creates things. I mean, it doesn't have a subtitle, right? I mean, that is the subtitle, or a modern Prometheus. And I, maybe she had to, I mean, now we think of Frankenstein and we know exactly what we're talking about. But when this came out, people were like, what is a Frankenstein? Like, that's some castle in Europe. We don't no idea what that is. We don't know who that is. We don't care who that is. It's hard for us to see that now because it's so iconic. But you see something like the modern Prometheus and you think, oh, I know that myth. And then you read a little blurb about it that says, it's about a mad doctor who creates this, reanimates a corpse, or, creates a man out of parts.
What a fantasy, though, huh? Reanimate grandma, pull her right out of the grave.
And apparently, so she had, we had that like sort of the week where they were all sort of trying to scare each other with ghost stories and things like that back in Geneva. But she also had a dream, and I think it was during that week, she had this dream about the doctor and this sort of like mad scientist who was trying to recreate life. And that kind of married with probably a lot of other things that were happening in her life. And she had a miscarriage recently, and the idea that, what is life, and how, can we control that, and who hasn't had that feeling of like, just give me one more day, just give me one more day with him.
Yeah.
And so all of those things are kind of happening simultaneously. But she did, and this is great because I think a lot of writers, and I know that there's a lot of artists, especially musicians, whose lyrics and concepts for songs come to them in dreams. And she dreamed this kind of mad scientist, and sort of his character was kind of scrawled out from there. So it's just a kind of a nice thing to think of, really, because horrifying dream, I'm sure, but the idea that we already have the story within us, right? As writers, that story's there. We just have to let it out, and we have to kind of like trust ourselves enough to write it and get it out, and then hopefully get a good editor to tell us what should stay and what shouldn't stay. But the
Yeah.
idea that even her idea came from something very organic like that. It was a spark that was her own little jolts of electricity. And I
Hmm.
find it very inspiring that we all, we can have that. We all have that within us, whatever the spark leads to.
Whatever. Yeah. Well, the novel I'm working on right now was sparked by another story. And the novel that I'm working on right now, that was sparked by another story, has actually sparked life back into the other story. So I can't wait to finish the novel that I'm working on right now, so I can go back to the original story and finish that novel. So
Right. It's like, and then they kind of play off of each other. And
yeah.
another thing that's interesting is she originally thought this was just going to be a short story. She had intended it to be a short story,
Mhm.
a rather short story. And it was Percy by Shelley and probably Lord Byron that they encouraged her to continue writing it and develop it as a novel, which, as you know, as a novelist, is no easy feat.
No. Three parts, right? And it ends up being, oh, I'm looking at the monkey paw. I was very curious to see whether the monkey paw was before or after. It actually ended up being 1902.
Yeah, the monkey paw. Yeah, that makes sense. And the monkey paw. I mean, there was, after Frankenstein, and especially during that spiritualist movement, not necessarily because people in the spiritualist movement were writing about sort of occult topics or horror, but you had a general cultural like lust for it. So things that had to do with ghosts and creepy kind of like tales and things like that were really kind of on the rise as people were going to these parlor games and trying to talk to dead people on Ouija boards and things like that. So but that was not the environment she was in. She laid the groundwork for novels to kind of do that, which is quite
Oh,
remarkable.
this is very interesting too. So, uh, okay, two things. 280 pages is the length of the book, which drives me crazy. I hate that it doesn't give me a word count. I
Of the
wish it would.
book,
Yeah.
let me see. I'll look at mine. Okay, so let's see. Mine's a paperback, so it's smaller than a 5x7. It's like a 3.5, and it's got 236 pages. So there's a formula here. So you can average. I'm trying to remember the formula. So I know with a five. Let me do it with a 5x7. Sorry, folks, we're doing math here. With a 5x7, so my novel or my book, it's a 5x7 size. My word count was about 55,000. And then with end notes and beginning notes, it ends up being a little over 200, and I think the signature is 224. So a smaller novel. So I'm going to say it's, okay, this is like totally guessing and terrible math, but I'm going to guess that it's probably around 60,000 words. We can probably Google this and get the answer to get the word count. How many words is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? But I'm guessing around 60,000. It's actually not that long for, long-winded novels of the time that were quite popular. It's not that long. And I'm looking, that includes endnotes and, whatever kind of, publisher's copyright page and a few things like that. So it could be even shorter.
Oh, I put you on mute,
Could be
didn't I?
longer.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can. I'm not muted.
Am I muted?
No? Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Whew, I had to yawn and I wasn't sure which was mute and which was not mute.
But can you hear me?
I
Okay.
Okay.
The
Um,
important thing is, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
So did you
Um,
Google how many words it is? Not yet. I'd say it's
no, I did not. I'm pacing back and forth now. So what the hell? What was my other point that I wanted to make?
it's not that long.
It's not that long. Dracula, 55,000, about that. Your novel, 55,000.
880 words, according to a very cursory Google search. So it's about 75,000 words.
75.
And I would say, your average novel is probably anywhere from, 55, 60 to, something like it is probably 150,000.
Yeah. And the other thing that was interesting that I looked up just now is that it had a very, very lukewarm life on the stage, but between 1823 and 1910. Then all of a sudden in 1910, it started getting productions. That's when it started being shown on the stage and then movies and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, that makes sense because that kind of, it became more popular to talk about sort of like, um, sort of good versus evil, and the ghost stories and things like that people began to just devour that kind of thing.
The advent of the camera, Edison, all that good stuff.
Sure.
Looking
Yeah.
for stories. I was like, hey, man, this make a good movie. Let's put this thing
Right.
on. I mean, it's very interesting how Hollywood kind of, adapted all those old stories. I don't think Frankenstein was unpopular during that time frame, the 80 years that it took for it to become a movie.
No, I mean,
Obviously.
that's kind of the miracle about it. I said before, it's never gone out of print. That's remarkable for a book to never go out of print. Lots of
Right.
things go in and out of print and then are resurrected, and it never went out of print. So it always maintained a certain. I mean, it's one of a kind. There are no other books like it.
They're making another movie this year with Javier Badem. Badam. How do you say his name?
I have no
Javier.
idea how to say it, but I love him.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. We'll never forgive him for the testicle banging that he did in the James Bond movie. What was it? The Casino Royale. Oh my God, I can't even stand thinking about it.
I I'm so sorry. I am not a James Bond girl
Oh,
at all, and I know basically nothing about anything
okay.
James Bond, and I have a big mental block when it comes to
Well, I have a
James
mental block too, just because of that.
Bond. Oh, okay. Well, that's good. Then I won't. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, the Frankenstein, like I said, starting this thing out, has permeated the culture. I say the word Frankenstein, I think of the monster.
Of
You say the
course.
word,
And you probably think of the one that looks like Boris Karloff,
you think of that. You think of
the original.
the
Yeah,
flat top. You think of the bolts on the neck. You think of
absolutely.
the
And
green
and I'm
skin.
and I'm okay with that. I mean, I love Boris Karloff, and I love that first movie. And I actually, I there's not much cheesy or otherwise that I don't love. I mean, I like the little wind-up toys with the giant head that looks like Frankenstein. I mean, I love all that stuff. It's
It's really sad in a way that Hollywood is gone. It's really sad in a way that we probably won't experience that going forward. That kind of permutation of a cultural icon type situation. The I Dream of Genies, the Frankensteins, the
Oh no,
Draculas
I mean,
with the
Harry Potter
capes.
is an excellent example of a fairly modern thing that's happened, and those were all
Yeah.
books first, and then they became movies, and now they have permeated the culture in a way that it's influenced publishing, it's influenced children's literature. There's
And
more
I
witch
guess
books
you have
out
a
there.
choice, though. You have a choice. You have either you have the camp of books, or you have the camp of movies. And I fall in the camp of the books. The movies did nothing for me personally.
But you're saying that most people think of right
Now,
because
I
this was
know when I was
published
a
in
kid, I
1818.
read
You don't
Frankenstein.
right, and you think
I
of
was the book on tape. I know I like picked up copies of Frankenstein. And I've read hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books in my life. I've been drowning in words and stories, and things have been flowing in and out of my life in this way or another. I've colored books and blah, blah, blah. So Frankenstein's been in and out of my life in one way or another throughout, I mean, one incarnation or another, right? I mean, but that's probably, I've lost my train of thought. What was I going to say?
Well, I think you're saying that, well, I don't know your train of thought, but my impression was that you were kind of talking about like, okay, so we have the choice whether we want to get our first image of this from a movie or a book, whereas with Frankenstein we don't, because
There
you
was
know,
so
it was
much.
published in 1818 or you know, whatever. But the thing is that you know, that monster, I mean, it was based on, I mean, it's not that far off from what, I mean, it wasn't green necessarily, like bright green, but it's not that far off from the description of this sort of like stitched together assemblage of a man. And the reason he had the face that he had is because that was the shape of Boris Karloff's head. If you've ever seen pictures of him, he had a wide, not as wide as in, you know, in the makeup, but you know, they worked with what they had. And that's how that became so iconic, because they created this like costume based on his own prominent features. And he had this
Yeah.
lovely sharp nose and this, you know, he had a substantial head. I mean, he was a substantial man.
I guess that's
So
my point, actually. Is my kids are going to have the opportunity to pick up Frankenstein, right? I mean, Frankenstein is always going to be there. Dracula is always going to be there. The Mummy's always going to be there. Those are going to be icons going forward forever because they're free. Movies are always going to be made about them because they're free. You don't have to pay anybody for them. Harry
right.
Potter is not going to be free for at least what, 80 years,
Oh,
maybe
probably not
even
even then.
longer.
Probably not even
Mickey
then. It's
Mouse
all
isn't
about
even going to be.
copyright
Yeah,
renewal. Yeah. It's
I
all
mean
about
that stuff
copyright
is
renewal.
expensive. I mean, you're not. That stuff is never going to be free, but that stuff is going to be free.
Right. Yeah. You can only copyright your own version of it, but you can't copyright the original because it's in the public domain now.
Yeah.
So
What are we missing on Frankenstein? What haven't we covered? I mean, I think this has been a great conversation about Mary Shelley and what she's offered the speculative fiction genre.
yeah, I mean we sort of just lightly touched on sort of the origin, and for anyone who doesn't know, I mean I kind of have been speaking it as if I'm assuming that people know this origin story, but I'd love to just recap it very briefly and sort of set the stage. Now, a lot of people do know this; it's more well known, but I'd love to just kind of talk about that. You know, the environment in which the original words were born, because I find it incredibly inspiring. You have you literally have a dark and stormy night. You have Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who was not quite Shelley then, I don't believe. I can't remember actually what year they were married, so forgive me. And Polidori, John William Polidori, Lord Byron's personal physician who traveled with him everywhere. And there's some speculation about whether or not that Mary Shelley had a sister that had traveled with her as well. And what's interesting is I've read tons and tons of like forwards and intros about that night and what had happened. But I learned the most when I read the novel The Vampire by John William Polidori, because I read it and I thought, God, this story sounds really familiar. He's not naming any names, but he's talking about this night. And I'm thinking, what the, this is how the same night Frankenstein was born. How can this be? How? And sure enough, you know, then I started researching who Polidori was. Oh, he's Lord Byron's physician. Anyway, they're in a lake house and they are trying to kind of get the best of each other and amuse each other. They read from a book of ghost stories, and then they get the idea, okay, who can write the most terrifying ghost story? And so they all sort of just like, you know, come up with something. And it wasn't all just in one night, it was over a couple of days. And Mary has this dream of this like mad scientist. And out of that night and that sort of like, you know, impromptu ghost salon, she had the bones of what became Frankenstein. She sort of had like this, you know, you can see pictures online of the intro that she had scratched down, kind of the developed a little bit of the Frankenstein character after she had the dream and wanted to capture everything that she remembered from it. And then you had Lord Byron came up with this idea of the vampire, who was sort of, this modern as in the 1800s, this kind of, wrestling with being part of modern society, but also being this like evil demonic entity. And he allegedly wrote a few pages and then just sort of threw it out. This is like, this is nothing. Well, Polidori also was there and loved the idea of writing this vampire novel and asked if he could, take the idea and run with it. And he did, and they published that. And then I can't remember, Shelley came up with something. He had a few things. He might have even written a play out of it. But that was sort of the stage that was set. And it's such a lovely idea because, as writers, we often really isolate ourselves. And I kind of think of that as like, one of those, like an impromptu literary salon or a writing class that, where the teacher writes a prompt up on the wall. And it's just kind of nice to think of them, all sort of sitting around and by candlelight writing these terrifying things. And no one could have known. If anybody's money was on anyone, it probably would have been on Lord Byron. He was the most famous of them all. And yet today, I can't tell you a Lord Byron quote, and I don't think many could without looking it up. But
I was just gonna look it up.
Tell me that, no Wikipedia, nice try. But you can tell me the plot of Frankenstein.
Yeah, I
or
could. In a
something
heartbeat.
about him. Yeah, so.
Hey, he looks just like Shelley's husband, honestly, Lord Byron.
Oh yeah,
Funny.
well the paintings and stuff. I mean, they all sort of had that. Were they fops or something? They had that kind of look.
Yeah. That's a good term for him. Yeah, it's really crazy. Don Juan, Manfred. Don Juan's a classic, huh?
Yeah, I never read it.
I've seen the one with what's it called? What was his name? The Godfather. My mind is gone. I am 40 years old and my mind is just
because you have 2.5-year-olds. It will slowly trickle back a little bit at a time, one board book at a time.
One board book.
It'll come back.
That's not what I hear. I hear this is it for me completely.
It's all downhill from here, Brian. Just suck it up and move on.
Stop
pointing it out.
We'll just leave it as Godfather. His name is the Godfather.
Robert De Niro?
No, the other one, the fat guy. Just so many inappropriate references are coming to mind.
Yeah, I know. You can edit it out later.
What is his name? The Apocalypse Now.
Oh, you're not talking about the director. You're not talking about Coppola.
Not Coppola. Not his name is. He was in The Freshman. He was in Superman. Come on. He was the Godfather. He was the Godfather.
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh my goodness, I'm going to Google.
I know you're trying so hard to do it without Google.
I can't do anything without Google anymore. I swear to God. I haven't typed in Google.
Oh, I already got it. It's like I feel super stupid, and you're gonna feel really stupid too. So.
I know, I already do.
Yeah.
Why isn't Google
telling me
Marlon
Brando? Yeah. Marlon Brando.
Oh my goodness, yeah, Marlon Brando. Why did I even look that up?
I don't know.
Who knows?
It's sad. You just
I don't even know why I even bothered looking that up.
I don't know. I'm just immersed in Frankenstein. I wasn't even really thinking about the mafia. That's a whole other fun one. I did like a lot of mafia movies when I was a kid. So.
Yeah, oh my God, I've watched that movie over and over and over again. Classic. Anyway, there was a point to me looking that up, and now I can't remember what it was. Did we do Mary Shelley justice? Hey, can you think of anything else that we need to cover?
Probably not.
I know you did a great job. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this with me. I did think of an excellent choice though for Mirage number next when you come on.
Ooh.
If we could do October for Halloween, and we can do Bram Stoker. You can do Dracula.
Yeah,
You
that's
could do
another one of my favorites, and I know a few secrets about him.
Oh,
So
really? That would be
yeah,
excellent. If
yeah.
you could put as much gusto into that one as you did this one, that would be a really great episode.
Oh,
What do you think?
reread it again for the 15th time. Yeah, I would love to. I am a great, I mean, he's one of my favorite authors, male, female, across genre. I mean, he's just, and that's another one of those books that I read at different points in my life and get different things out of. So you know what? It's been probably about 4 or 5 years since I've last read it. So I will take it up again. It'll be the perfect thing to read as we're going into October, and I will hit you with a bunch of fresh, weird thoughts about Dracula.
Wonderful. I'm super excited. And unless you could think of somebody else that you want to scare the poop out of us with, totally up to you.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a really insane guy who wrote a lot about werewolves that no one's really heard of, but
Oh.
you know,
I'm going to leave it up to you because honestly, you're the one that's going to have the opportunity to freak us out. I bet you could if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, the werewolf guy is pretty freaky because it's not a work of fiction.
Ooh.
Yeah, so I don't know if that counts in Mirage. So that's
I
the
don't
other
know.
thing. Yeah, so well,
All
we'll
right.
take it offline. Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll figure it
let me
out.
take this offline. I thank you so much. This has been so
Thank you.
fantastic.
It's great. It's coffee talk. It's wonderful talking with you, or wine talk,
Yeah.
or whatever,
I've wine talk,
Yeah.
coffee talk, geeking out about speculative
Geeking
fiction.
out. Yeah.
Always a joy.
Thanks for letting me geek out. I feel like a
Yeah.
total geek. I feel like a not really scholarly, but total geek. So, and I'm sure people will listen to this and have lots and lots of corrections, and that's fine. You know, I'm
I'll
but
let
a
you.
humble writer with, just my point of view. That's all I
Yeah,
have.
I'm just a speculative writer. I just love it. Finding out new ways to mess
I'm
things
just
up is
gonna
my
make it
forte.
up if I don't know, right?
That's right. If nobody corrects me, I feel
This
good about
is
myself.
fiction.
I'm alone in my basement looking around. Nobody's trying to tell me I'm wrong.
It's all good.
All right. Thank you so much. I really
Okay. Thank
appreciate
you
it.
too. Thank
All
you
right.
so
Bye-bye.
much.